Get your hands where I can see them, or I will put you on that pavement myself. That was the first thing Officer Grant Colby said to a 63-year-old grandmother on a Tuesday evening in October before he had run her plates. Before spray, before he had asked her name, before he had done anything but look at her skin and her car and decide he already knew everything he needed to know. Rewind 11 hours, before the badge, before the trunk, before the room full of 200 officers went so quiet you could hear the ice machine humming 3 floors down. The town of Widows Point, Maine sits where Route 1A curls along the coast like a held breath, granite cliffs on one side and cold Atlantic water on the other, lobster buoys bobbing red and green in the afternoon light. It is the kind of town that puts wreaths on its lampposts in July because someone thinks it's charming, the kind of town where the harbor smells like salt and diesel and money. At 6:52 p.m. that evening, the sky over the water had gone the color of a bruise healing, orange bleeding into purple, and a deep forest green Jaguar F-Type R moved down the coastal road at exactly 4 miles under the posted limit. Eleanor Vance drove the way she did everything else in her life. Precisely, without apology, and without needing anyone's permission to take up space. 63 years old, a widow of 11 years, a grandmother to 5 children who called her Nana E and fought over who got to ride in the front seat of whatever she was driving that week. Silver hair cut close and sharp, a wool coat the color of oxblood, hands resting light on the wheel at 10 and 2, the exact position she had drilled into 3 decades of rookies back in Boston. For 34 years, Eleanor Vance had worn a badge. She had started as a beat officer in Roxbury in 1990 and finished as deputy superintendent of the Boston Police Department's Bureau of Professional Standards, the department inside the department that investigates the investigators. She had dismantled 4 corrupt precincts from the inside. She had testified in front of grand juries, with her voice never once rising above a conversational register. The people of Widows Point believed she had come to their town to retire, to buy herself a car she'd wanted since she was 26, and finally had the money for to watch the tide come in from a porch she owned outright. What the public did not know, what the town council had voted 11-2 in a closed session to keep sealed until 9 o'clock the following morning, was that Eleanor Vance had been hired as the new chief of the Widows Point Police Department. 6 weeks earlier, a Portland Herald reporter named Diane Ashford had published 11,000 words on a pension fund embezzlement scandal that ended the old chief's 31-year career in a single news cycle. The town needed someone from outside, someone with no golf buddies on the force, no nephew in dispatch, no favors owed. They needed someone who could walk into a rotten building and not flinch at the smell. 2 miles behind her in a cruiser, idling at the mouth of a gravel turnout, Officer Grant Colby watched the Jaguar pass and felt something in his chest tighten the way it always did around a certain kind of car, driven by a certain kind of person. Colby was 41 years old, 13 years on the Widows Point force, built like a man who spent more time in the gym than in continuing education, and carrying 8 excessive force complaints that the police union had quietly buried before they ever reached a hearing. In the passenger seat sat Officer Nathan Pierce, 24, 4 months out of the academy, still young enough to believe that the uniform meant something clean. "Would you look at that," Colby said, already shifting into drive. "140 grand rolling through my town. She's not speeding, Grant." Pierce had the radar gun in his lap. 54 in a 58. "I don't care what the gun says." Colby pulled out onto the coastal road, closing the distance fast. "You see who's behind that wheel?" Older black woman, out-of-state plates, driving a car that costs more than this whole department's budget for traffic enforcement. Either that's stolen or somebody's laundering something through her, and I intend to find out which. "Grant, we don't have cause." She crossed the double yellow back at the marina turn. I saw it. Nathan Pierce had not seen it. There had been no double yellow line for Eleanor Vance to cross. The road at the marina turn was a single dotted lane. The town hadn't bothered to repaint in 6 years. But Pierce also understood, the way every rookie in that building understood within his first month, that there was an unwritten rule at Widows Point PD, and the rule was this: you did not cross Grant Colby, and you did not question him in front of a civilian. With his stomach folding in on itself, Pierce reached over and hit the lights. Notice the object in Eleanor's passenger seat as she reaches for it. A small tin box, the size of a deck of cards, dented at one corner. It will matter later. Keep it in your mind. In her rearview mirror, Eleanor watched the light bar begin its slow red and blue pulse and let out a breath through her nose, the kind of breath a person takes when they've done this exact thing 400 times before. Though never once from this side of the stop. She signaled early. She eased the Jaguar onto the wide gravel shoulder with the smooth, unhurried competence of someone who had taught this exact maneuver to 2 decades of recruits at the academy in Boston. She shifted into park, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the wheel, fingers spread, visible. Colby didn't bother with a flashlight. The overhead street lamp gave him more than enough light to see her face, calm and unbothered, and something about that calm made his jaw tighten before she had said a single word. License, registration, proof of insurance. No greeting. He leaned his forearm against her door hard enough to leave a faint gray smudge on the pristine paint. "Good evening, officer," Eleanor said, her voice low, even, unhurried. "May I ask the reason for the stop?" I asked the questions. Colby's hand drifted to rest on the butt of his service weapon, a gesture that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with intimidation. "Hand over the documents before I pull you out of this car for resisting." 34 years in law enforcement had inoculated Eleanor Vance against exactly this kind of theater. She knew precisely what Colby was doing, because she had spent a career writing reports about men who did it. What she also knew, what made her jaw set just slightly tighter, was that the mayor's office had placed a hard embargo on her identity until the following morning's 9 o'clock press conference. Tonight, as far as the entire world was concerned, she was a private citizen named Eleanor Vance, and nothing more. "My license is in my purse, on the passenger seat," she said, narrating the movement of her own hands the way she'd drilled into recruits for 20 years, so that no reasonable person watching could mistake it for anything but transparency. She retrieved a Massachusetts driver's license and the Jaguar's registration and passed them through the window. Colby snatched the documents without looking at them. "Vance. Whose car is this, Vance?" "Mine." "Sure, it is." He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and clicked on a tactical flashlight, aiming it directly into her eyes, though the street lamp had already lit her face fully. "Step out of the vehicle." Pierce, standing near the rear bumper, took a half step forward. "Grant, we could just run the plate." "Shut up, Pierce." Colby didn't turn around. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Now." "Under Pennsylvania v. Mims, you have the authority to order me out of the car," Eleanor said, reciting the Supreme Court precedent with the flat precision of someone who had cited it in sworn testimony more than once. "I'd like it noted for the record that I have committed no traffic violation, and you have articulated no reasonable suspicion to detain me beyond this point." Colby's face went a deep, ugly red. There was a particular kind of contempt he reserved for civilians who knew the law well enough to speak to him as an equal, and an extra measure of it for a black woman who did it without raising her voice. "Get out of the car before I put this window through and drag you out by your hair." She opened the door and stepped into the cold ocean wind. 5'5" of her, and she carried it like she was 6 feet tall. "Turn around. Hands on the roof." She complied without a word. Colby began patting her down with no female officer present and no articulated suspicion of a weapon. a violation so basic that Nathan Pierce, standing 11 feet away, felt his stomach drop through the gravel. "What exactly are we looking for, officer?" Eleanor asked, her voice dangerously quiet now, quiet in the specific way of someone choosing every word. I said, "Shut up." Finding nothing, Colby turned to the car. Without asking, without a whisper of consent, he leaned into the driver's seat and began tearing the interior apart. Glove box wrenched open, papers and a tire gauge dumped onto the floor mats, his utility belt scraping a long white scratch across the leather console. "You do not have my consent to search this vehicle," Eleanor said. "I smell marijuana." Colby said it the way a man recites a line he has used 100 times before, smooth, rehearsed, and completely false. There was no scent in that car, except new leather and the faint trace of her perfume, and Nathan Pierce knew it, and said nothing. Colby popped the trunk. He found a slim leather portfolio and tore it open, hoping for cash, for contraband, for anything that would justify the last 4 minutes. Instead, he found a 2-inch stack of heavily redacted files, an internal affairs dossier, headers he was too high on his own adrenaline to actually read. Beside the file sat a small, dented tin box. He flipped it open with his thumb. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were 2 badges. One gleamed, brand new, gold, the shield of a chief of police not yet sworn in. The other was old, tarnished silver, the edges worn soft from decades of a hand running over it, engraved with a number and a name that was not Eleanor's. "What is this?" Colby said, holding the old badge up to the streetlight and laughing. "Some kind of family heirloom cosplay. I should write you up for impersonating an officer with this junk." "I would strongly suggest," Eleanor said, and something in her voice dropped an octave, carrying a razor of authority that made even Colby's spine go cold for half a second before his ego crushed the feeling flat, "that you put my father's badge back exactly where you found it." He slammed the trunk shut instead. "Lucky I'm in a good mood tonight, Grandma." He shoved her license against her chest, hard enough to make her take a half step back. "I'm writing you up for failure to maintain a lane. Next time you drive through my town, you'd better look over your shoulder. Now, get this shiny little toy off my road before I have it towed." She took the license back without flinching, and while he talked, she read his badge. Colby, G, number 2117. She filed it away the way she'd filed away 1,000 numbers before, the way you file away the exact temperature of a room right before something in it changes. Then she looked at the trembling, 24-year-old standing 11 feet away. Pierce, N, number 2390. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, and got back into a car with a wrecked glove box and a scratched console, and pulled away into the dark. In the cruiser, Colby was already laughing, loose and pleased with himself. "That's how you handle them, rookie. Show them who runs the streets. I guarantee she never drives through this town again." Pierce stared out the window at the black water and said nothing, a sick sinking feeling settling into his gut that he could not yet name. He should have turned his body camera on. Colby had told him to leave it off before the shift even started, the way he always did. Nathan Pierce would spend the rest of that night lying awake in a twin bed in an apartment above the hardware store, staring at the ceiling, replaying 11 different moments where he could have said something and hadn't. Hold on to that tin box. You have not seen the last of it. The Widows Point police station was a squat brick building 3 blocks off the harbor that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and floor polish. At 7:35 the next morning, the locker room buzzed with a nervous electric energy that had nothing to do with the cold snap coming off the water. The previous chief had resigned in disgrace 5 weeks earlier after Diane Ashford's exposé ran 3 days in a row on the front page of the Portland Herald. 8 years of pension fund manipulation, $840,000 unaccounted for, 2 councilmen implicated. Today, Mayor Charles Whitfield was coming to personally introduce the new chief. The rumor mill had it locked down for weeks. Captain Roy Fenwick, a widow's point lifer with 22 years on the job, and a laugh you could hear from the parking lot, was a lock for the promotion. He would keep things running the way they'd always run. Colby, standing in front of his locker, adjusting his tie, with the satisfaction of a man who had already spent his imaginary sergeant's raise, was in a spectacular mood. "Looking sharp," said Officer Dale Whitcomb, slapping him on the shoulder. "Ready for the new boss?" "Fenwick's a good man," Colby said. "Knows how this town actually works. We'll be fine." Across the room, Nathan Pierce laced his boots with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking since 7 p.m. the night before. At 7:58, the intercom crackled. "All personnel to the main assembly room." 211 officers, detectives, dispatchers, and civilian staff filed into a room built for half that many, folding chairs, scraping concrete, the particular tense silence of a building that knows something is about to be taken from it. Mayor Charles Whitfield walked to the podium at exactly 8 a.m. He was tall, gray at the temples, a man who had campaigned 2 years earlier on the single word, reform, printed on 11,000-yard signs across the county. For 5 years, he began, no preamble, "This department has cost the taxpayers of Widows Point $2. 3 millionaires in settled excessive force lawsuits. 5 years. This department is broken and everyone in this room knows it." A low, dissenting murmur rolled through the veteran rows. Colby crossed his arms and rolled his eyes at Whitcomb. "Here we go. When I went looking for a new chief," Whitfield continued, his voice climbing, "I did not look inside this building. The rot goes too deep for that." Colby's smug expression flickered. "I looked for someone with an unimpeachable 34-year record. Someone who rose from a beat cop in Roxbury to deputy superintendent of Boston's Bureau of Professional Standards. Someone who has taken apart 4 corrupt departments from the inside, brick by brick, and left them better than she found them." The side door opened. Every sound in that room stopped at once. 200 folding chairs, 200 pairs of lungs, the hum of the ice machine. 3 floors down suddenly, the loudest thing in the building. Footsteps crossed the hardwood in a class. A uniform, pressed to a razor edge, 4 gold stars gleaming on each collar. A gold badge pinned dead center of her chest, catching the fluorescent light. The exact badge Grant Colby had dismissed as a novelty toy 11 hours earlier. In the second row, Colby stopped breathing. Every drop of blood left his face at once, leaving him the color of wet ash. His heart slammed once, hard against his ribs, like something trying to break out. The confident sneer he'd worn into that room simply dissolved, replaced by a kind of animal terror he had never once felt while wearing a badge himself. It was her, the grandmother, the jaguar, the trunk. Less than 14 hours ago, he had searched her, mocked her, threatened her, and here she was, walking to the podium like she owned the floor beneath her feet, because as of this morning, she did. Chief Eleanor Vance did not glance at her notes. She scanned the room slowly, deliberately, until her eyes landed on Colby and locked there without blinking. A slow, chillingly composed smile crossed her face. "Good morning, officers," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying to the back wall without ever rising in volume. "I trust everyone had a productive patrol last night." The temperature of the room dropped by what felt like 20 degrees. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't slammed a fist on the podium. She had simply let the weight of who she was settle over 200 officers like a held breath finally released. And somehow that was worse. In the second row, a single cold bead of sweat traced its way down Colby's spine. His mind scrambled for the odds that she hadn't recognized him, that the darkness of the highway had blurred his face, the way it had blurred hers. But her eyes on him told him everything he needed to know before she said another word. She remembered every second of it. "For decades," she continued, "a badge in this town has been treated as a shield for men who believe the uniform places them above the Constitution. That ends this morning. I have read every personnel file in this building. I know which complaints were buried. I know which citizens were told to be quiet and go home. A pause, her gaze sweeping the room and settling once more on Colby. And I know exactly how some of you behave when you think nobody with any power is watching. In the back row, Nathan Pierce felt something twist in his chest, relief and dread arriving together, indistinguishable. The woman he had watched endure an illegal search on a dark shoulder of Route 1A 12 hours earlier was now the single, most powerful law enforcement officer in the county. She had not been helpless. She had been patient. Starting today, any officer carrying more than 3 unresolved excessive force complaints is placed on immediate administrative leave pending full review. If you violated the oath you swore to this town, I strongly suggest you have your resignation on my desk by noon. If you choose to stay and fight it, I promise you personally that I will see you stripped of your pension and prosecuted to the fullest extent the law allows. A beat, flat, and final. You're all dismissed. If you think that was the worst moment of Grant Colby's day, you have another 90 minutes to sit through with him. It gets much worse. The room broke into chaotic noise the second she stepped off the stage. 200 conversations colliding at once. Colby shot out of his chair like it had caught fire and shoved through the crowd toward the one man he thought could save him. Sergeant Roy Fenwick, his union representative, standing near the exit typing frantically on his phone. "Roy, I need a rep right now." His voice cracked despite every effort to keep it steady. Fenwick looked up, face pale and drawn, and put his phone away without meeting Colby's eyes. "I can't help you, Grant." "What are you talking about?" "You're the union rep. I pay my dues. The new chief just sent a direct message to my phone." Fenwick's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "She wants you in her office. Right now, today." The floor seemed to actually tilt under Colby's boots. He turned and saw Nathan Pierce standing a few feet away, looking like a man waiting for a firing squad, and something ugly and suspicious flickered across Colby's face for the first time. Fenwick walked away without another word, leaving Colby alone with the rookie he'd told to keep his body camera off. The walk to the 4th-floor office felt like a funeral procession down a hallway too brightly lit to hide in. Colby told himself, over and over, that he was a 13-year veteran, that he could talk his way out of anything, the way he always had. His hand shook on the brass door handle before he finally pushed it open. Chief Eleanor Vance sat behind a wide oak desk, uniform jacket off, the 4 gold stars still gleaming at her collar. The redacted internal affairs files from her trunk sat stacked in a neat pile in front of her. To her right stood 2 men in dark suits, state-level internal affairs investigators, flown in the night before, waiting for exactly this meeting. Colby stopped breathing again the moment he saw them. "Close the door, Officer Colby." Her voice was almost gentle, and that gentleness was somehow the most terrifying thing in the room. He and Pierce sat in stiff leather chairs across from her. She turned a silver laptop toward them and pressed a key. Crystal clear video filled the screen, the traffic stop, but not from any dash cam. A different angle entirely. It had been her car the whole time. "My vehicle carries a full perimeter recording system," Eleanor said, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "Audio, video, uploaded live to a secure server. I watched you manufacture probable cause. I watched you conduct an illegal frisk with no female officer present. I watched you tear apart a private vehicle with no consent and no cause. In 7 minutes, you violated 4 department protocols and 3 constitutional protections." Colby's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He tried again. "Chief, I can explain. It was dark. We've had drug activity on that stretch. I made a judgment call based on experience." She let out a short, humorless laugh that sent a fresh wave of cold through his chest and leaned forward until her eyes were level with his. "You made a judgment call based on the color of my skin and the price of my car. And last night was not an isolated incident. Was it, Grant? She tapped the stack of files. 13 years. These are the dossiers you were too busy playing hero to actually read when you tore open my trunk. Andre Simmons, 2019. A broken wrist during a stop for a broken taillight, settled for $140,000. The Alvarez family, 2021. Your name is on the complaint twice. Priya Kapoor, a college sophomore, held face down on the pavement outside a coffee shop for 11 minutes in 2023 because you decided her backpack looked suspicious. 3 names. There are 9 more in this stack. The previous administration looked away because your arrest numbers were good for the monthly report. I do not care about your numbers. I care about the law. Notice she still hasn't raised her voice once. Watch what happens when she finally turns to the rookie. She turned her gaze to Nathan Pierce, and he flinched like she'd struck him. Officer Pierce, you are 4 months out of the academy. Last night you watched a senior officer violate a woman's civil rights on a public road, and you neither intervened nor filed a report. Why? His voice cracked on the first word. He told me to keep my mouth shut, Chief. Said that's how things work here. I was scared. I know I failed my duty. I'm sorry. She studied him for a long, silent moment, and something in her eyes softened from fury into a stern, almost maternal disappointment. Fear doesn't excuse cowardice, Officer Pierce. But I know exactly what it feels like to be a rookie under the thumb of a corrupt veteran. She paused. What you don't know is that you weren't assigned to Officer Colby's cruiser last night by accident. I requested it. I needed a witness who wasn't already on his payroll of favors, someone clean enough to corroborate footage I already knew I was going to capture. Colby's head snapped toward Pierce, betrayal and fury flooding his face. You set me up. He lunged half out of his chair before the 2 agents were on him, twisting his arms behind his back and pressing him face first into the polished oak. I did not set you up, Grant, Eleanor said, not moving from her seat as the scene unfolded in front of her. I drove my own car on a public road. You chose to pull me over. You chose to break the law 13 separate ways in 7 minutes. You built this room yourself. I only turned on the light. She stood, walked around the desk, and looked down at him, pinned and gasping against the wood. Officer Grant Colby, you are terminated from the Widows Point Police Department, effective immediately. You are under arrest for deprivation of civil rights under color of law, official oppression, and battery. He wept, not from remorse, not yet, but from the sudden, total collapse of a version of himself he had spent 13 years believing was untouchable. As they walked him out through the bullpen in handcuffs, he was still talking, still explaining, telling anyone who would listen that it had been a judgment call, that the road was dark, that he'd been doing his job. Nobody in that hallway stopped walking to listen. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't quite. 3 weeks later, the Portland Herald ran Diane Ashford's follow-up under the headline, 12 Victims and Counting, laying out the full internal affairs record Colby had once held in his own hands and dismissed as garbage. 9 more names came forward in the 6 weeks after the article ran. 9 people who had been too afraid, or too certain nothing would come of it, to file a complaint while Colby still wore the badge. The Widows Point Town Council voted to reopen every one of his prior arrests for review. 3 convictions were later vacated. Colby pleaded guilty to 2 federal civil rights counts to avoid trial and was sentenced the following spring to 18 months, stripped of his pension in a separate civil proceeding that Eleanor Vance herself testified in, calmly, without a single raised word, exactly as she had testified 100 times before. At his sentencing, when the judge asked if he had anything to say, Grant Colby stood, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, he did not explain. He did not mention the dark road or the drug activity or his years of experience. He said only, I thought wearing this badge meant I got to decide who mattered. I was wrong, and there were people who paid for that before I ever understood it. It was not much. But Eleanor Vance, sitting in the third row, noted that it was the first true sentence she had ever heard him say. Nathan Pierce did not lose his job. Chief Vance kept him on under a formal mentorship condition and quietly began pairing him with the department's most respected senior officers instead of its most feared one. 6 months later, on a bitter February morning, Pierce pulled over a driver on Route 1A for a genuinely broken taillight. An elderly man, white, in an old pickup truck with a dog in the passenger seat, and instead of running the man's plates for warrants first, Pierce simply helped him find the loose wire, refastened the light housing with electrical tape from his own trunk, and sent him on his way with no ticket at all. He filed a full incident report anyway, the way he'd been trained to since the day he sat across from Eleanor Vance's desk with his hands shaking in his lap. 5 months after the sentencing, on a gray Sunday morning with fog rolling low off the harbor, Eleanor Vance drove the same forest green Jaguar down the same stretch of Route 1A alone, the interior fully repaired, the leather console re-stitched to match the original grain so closely you'd never know it had been torn. She pulled into a quiet gravel turnout, the same one, though she never mentioned that to anyone, and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the gulls. She reached into the glove box and took out the small dented tin box. She opened it. Her father's badge lay there, tarnished silver, worn soft at the edges from a hand that had rubbed it thin over 40 years of carrying it in a town that had never once promoted him past corporal, despite 11 attempts and a record cleaner than any man who outranked him. Walter Vance had died in 1998, still believing the badge itself was worth more than what most of the men around him did with it. Eleanor closed her hand around it for a long moment, the way she did most Sundays now, and did not need to say anything to anyone, because there was no one there to hear it. Then she put it back in the box, next to her own, closed the lid, and drove on toward the water. If this story reached something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, maybe even a version of yourself in one of the silences, hit like so it finds the person who needs to hear it next. Share it with someone who needs reminding that being quiet in a room doesn't mean being invisible. And leave a comment. Have you ever stood in that room, on one side or the other? I read every single one.